Hello, and welcome back to the channel Zenin Fanfics. Today, we're kicking off part 20 of an exciting series. What if Villain Deku became a teacher at UA? If you enjoy this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more content in the future. The author of this story is Bloomer Bill from Fanfiction.net. All the relevant links are in the description. Feel free to say hello to the author on their profile. Now, let's dive into the fanfic. Izuku messed up. He had messed up bad. You see, those villains that had kidnapped him yesterday turned out to be not regular villains, which was obvious considering that they were clearly well off if they could buy the expensive booze to serve people. But Izuku didn't think that meant that they were working directly for All for One. However, as the Vespas so kindly informed him, the two villains, Kurogiri, indeed the Misty One, and Shigaraki Tamura, was the one he had referred to as Pale Blue, were very deep in All for One inner circle, and the Vespas questioned Izuku how he encountered them, since they rarely did anything that wasn't ordered by All for One. So Izuku was justifiably very freaked out and didn't sleep that night, because he kept getting up to double, triple check the locks on the doors and windows were secure. He couldn't sit still for long as his paranoia fully took hold, and he kept a tight grip on the taser in one hand and his work phone in the other, ready to call the Vespas if he saw anyone that shouldn't be outside. He was tired when the sun rose, but refused to let himself shirk his duties to his students over his mistakes, and went on with his day, eyes darting around in the same paranoia. The people, of course, noticed just how tense and tired he was. The South Side was his second home, and the people there knew him the best. But that wasn't Izuku's big mistake. No, if it had just been that Izuku might be able to one day laugh this off as a life lesson to be more cautious in the future, if only it hadn't been for what he did next, since he had subsequently dug himself deeper into this mess. Because as he was reminded, he had foolishly given Kurogiri his work number, and the man had texted him sometime after he finished with Dabi's lesson. Izuku knew his first reaction should have been to ditch the phone, but all of his students had already associated the number with him, and to undo that would take a long time, since he'd need to get a new number and spread that to thousands. And for a brief second, Izuku considered ignoring the text and pretending that none of this was happening, but from what the Vespas had told him of Tamura's temper, such a thing would likely enrage the man, and he'd retaliate against Izuku, either by going after him directly or attacking his students. So, probably dooming himself, he texted Kurogiri back, and against his better judgment set up a regular schedule for when he'd come by, what he would teach Tamura, and for how long he'd be there per day. Which was how he got himself into this very big mess, fully expecting to not come back when a purple-black portal of mist to appear in front of him, and being surprised when he was just standing in the same bar they took him to the first time, with just Tamura and Kurogiri in the room with him. Izuku was incredibly tense as he went about the math and geography lesson, but he didn't let it show, since fear like that would have been dangerous in this situation, and Tamura seemed to be frustrated just trying to understand what Izuku was saying. And having seen Tamura's obsession with games, though it wasn't that hard for Izuku to adjust the lesson by using one of the games he knew, though it wasn't as popular as a pre-quirk game, Tamura got pretty into it as Izuku continued to give him different goals outside of the real tasks of the game. The only hang-up was that Tamura was having difficulty drawing up the real-world version of the map, since his quirk apparently turned things to dust. After he destroyed the fifth pen he was given was what led Izuku to experience Tamura throwing a fit. It started fairly mild compared to how bad Kaken's were, and even though Izuku was worried about Tamura using his quirk on him, the familiarness of the situation had set him at ease. He didn't even flinch when a bottle shot straight past his head and shattered with such force a shard cut his cheek. His lack of reaction to that was what finally brought Tamura out of the fit as he stared at Izuku confused, something that felt odd to Izuku, as he was sure he would have been used to such a thing given Kurogiri wasn't reacting either. But then again, that might be more unusual than he believed it. Izuku hadn't even acknowledged the fit had happened as he placed a bandage on his cheek before he searched in his bag for a pair of gloves meant for 5-point contact quirks, then offered them to Tamura. The man, slight riled up, was very skeptical of the odd gloves working to stop his quirk, but was elated when they did. At the end of the session, Kurogiri asked if he could let Tamura keep the gloves, since he had an awful habit of his fits destroying a lot of things, and they were cycling through 10 new controllers a month. Izuku had no problem with that, and understood Tamura's excitement over his new loot. The following sessions were tense, but for very different reasons than he originally thought it would, the idea originally being that he was being duped either into working for All for One or slowly led into a trap, but he doubted that All for One would be so patient with the two toes directly threatening his empire. Instead, it was something he noticed in his second session with Tamura that caused most of his unease. Because as old as they were, Izuku would know primordial shoes anywhere, and he knew Swiss shoes almost as well, like the ones Tamura was wearing. The revelation that Tamura was once quirkless made a lot of sense, given he had regular human fingertips, something that was near impossible, since most touch or hand-based quirks always caused the fingerprints to disappear, at least if they didn't develop finger pads like Achiko-chan's. And Tamura's body possibly wasn't compatible with the quirk either, since he was constantly scratching himself, and his skin looked so dry, flaking off large in patches, something that could get concerning fast, but that wasn't the most upsetting part of it. No, it was the why All for One kept the two toes in his inner circle, when everyone knew the man couldn't stand them, that made him uneasy. Namely, because Tamura didn't seem to realize he or Izuku were quirkless, since most two toes would recognize each other on sight at their age. So with caution, Izuku would grow closer to Tamura during their sessions, using co-op games to teach the man basic concepts, and quickly suspected that Tamura never went to school or left the bar much with how unsocialized he was. It wasn't even that hard to get close to Tamura, because after seeing the man 4 times a week and regularly gaming with him, the man considered Izuku a decent DLC character to train with. Tamura was also getting remarkably calmer compared to when they first met. Tamura was still throwing fits and would rage quit fairly regularly, but he stopped destroying things with his quirk, even if he was still throwing around the furniture and his stuff. But it was an improvement all the same, according to Kurogiri. A month was also long enough for Izuku to notice that for some reason, despite being in All for One's inner circle, the two of them didn't do anything, or that they knew much, since Tamura would complain about that more often than not. Something that made even less sense, since he could maybe understand All for One making more powerful and loyal soldiers by giving Two Toes quirks. But then why wouldn't he use them for anything? Because both Tamura and Kurogiri were terrifyingly powerful with a bit of training, but spent most of their day in this bar, doing whatever they could to pass the time, waiting for orders and occasionally vetting recruits when they wandered in. It just didn't make sense why All for One would waste the resources. Tamura's power was obvious, as was Kurogiri's, since Kurogiri had agreed to transport him everywhere he wanted so long as Izuku had a GPS location for him. The man had no limits that had been found as of yet, but opening over 20 portals was mentally complicated, according to what Kurogiri was willing to tell Izuku. Since All for One hadn't taken Kurogiri's quirk and didn't kill Tamura outright, that must have meant the two men had some importance to All for One's plans. So Izuku decided to see if he could find either of their past lives before joining with All for One, but came up with nothing, which was weird. Tamura he could understand, since he would have been a Two Toes before All for One and wouldn't be publicly recorded if he did commit any crimes. But Kurogiri would have definitely had a record before now with how tightly regulated teleportation quirks were, even if Kurogiri had been quick enough to not be noticed and smart enough to only use it in areas without cameras. There weren't even headlines about the odd missed child, since such people were still quite rare. He could ask the Vespas to dig for more information, but that would only bring more attention to him, and the Vespas, if they started asking pointed questions about two apparently important people to All for One's plans. And getting more of All for One's attention was something he needed to avoid for as long as possible, regardless of the reason. So Izuku would have to try find who they were before they were criminals at all. He had no idea where to start looking for Kurogiri, since he hadn't found any matching children in online yearbooks, and the man hardly spoke at all outside of business. So he had no leads for him. Tamura, on the other hand, was an open book, relatively speaking. Once Izuku had boosted his relationship with Tamura, the man started commenting on things more freely around him and told Izuku more about himself. The main takeaway was that Tamura couldn't remember much clearly from before his 7th birthday, which was a massive red flag in his opinion. There were bits and pieces from when he was 6, and All for One introduced him to Kurogiri for the first time, but anything before that was too hard to remember, and Tamura wasn't invested in figuring it out. Tamura vaguely knew something bad happened when he was 6, but he couldn't recall anything at all other than it left him wandering the streets alone looking for help. But everyone would turn him away, and All for One was the one who saved him. There was a lot for Izuku to unpack there for another time, but right now he was going to focus purely on the facts. Tamura, if what he did remember was correct, then there was some kind of accident when he was 6 that left him homeless, and he was found by All for One. From that, Izuku started a search for family tragedies involving a young male, with the matching initials SD in newspapers online going as far back as 59 since he didn't peg Tamura being any older than 22. Using the same initials of Tamura's alias was a stretch, but it was all he had to go on, and he could do another broader search later. And after the first couple of hours dredging through thousands of papers, Izuku felt kind of stupid, but eventually he found the Shimura family massacre of 61. A simple-looking family that unfortunately had been targeted by some villain, and all 6 members of the family and their beloved family pet had been found dead the following morning by a neighbor willing to be interviewed. One who described the bodies as rotting away before her eyes into ashy pulp. There weren't any pictures in the papers naturally, but Izuku hazarded a guess that the bodies weren't that different from what would happen to someone that Tamura touched with all 5 fingers. A fact that first drew his attention, but once he saw a picture of the family with their names attached, he knew this was the family he was looking for. There were 2 children in the family, a young girl named Hannah that could float as long as she held her breath, a name Izuku recognized as being spelt the same way Tamura did when he named the first female party members without fail. Hell, Izuku remembered how Tamura spent hours leveling up a mana he named Hannah just so he could keep it in his party, and how Tamura stubbornly refused to part with the Pokemon, transferring it over to his new games as soon as possible. The boy Tenko was a near-dead ringer for the man Tamura was now. Namely, the only major difference in appearance was that Tenko had the same black hair as his sister, but that could be explained merely by dyeing hair, or even a side effect of whatever number of quirks All for One used on him. However, it was the fact that Tenko was biologically quirkless, and that was all but confirmed Tenko and Tamura had to be the same person. The only hitch was Tenko's body was discovered at the house. But for a man like All for One, getting a human cadaver that looked like Tenko would be laughably easy. He could probably make it himself with the right quirks, and the DNA database could be tempered with at any time, so that hardly proved anything to Izuku. 2 toes weren't as uncommon as most people believed, but it was true that the birth rates were lowered by 100 surviving infants at a high ball yearly number in Japan, given how strong the quirk genes were in the local population, due to All for One. In most places it was 1 in 4, but this small pool in Japan made it almost certainty that for the 2 boys, being unrelated near impossible, especially since neither of their parents had any siblings or known family outside of their grandparents. On the mother's side, unsurprisingly, this knowledge didn't give him much to work with. Izuku knew Tamura's real name and family now, but the knowledge wouldn't give him much wiggle room with the man. And looking into the family didn't show him much about why All for One would target this family, and so thoroughly that he'd have them all killed. Fake Tenko's death of all things, and possibly almost completely erase Tenko's memory of who he was before he rescued him. There were plenty of 2 toes out there. Why did this family receive such a ruthless slaughter? Regardless of whether it was directly by All for One's hands or not, and if it was by Tenko's unfortunate hands at 6 years old for whatever godforsaken reason, only made Izuku more baffled and personally horrified. The thought of a young child not understanding what was wrong with them as their body was changed by an unknown and unexpected quirk for who knows how long before they try to reach for a member of their family, like any other day, only for them to start falling apart in front of them in a gruesome demise, and when they run for help everyone else starts falling apart until they realize they were the ones killing their family was perfect for a short horror movie. The sadistic part of Izuku's brain, that apparently loved torturing him, gleefully put him in that exact scenario, with the only change that it was his students in the community center in the South Side. It was no surprise that he ended up emptying his stomach when he woke up this morning desperately trying to forget what the children looked like as they fell apart in his hands screaming. It was likely due to the emotional whiplash of the nightmare that caused Izuku to do something so incredibly foolish and push his luck. Izuku had bought a pair of primordial shoes and dyed them black, then decorated them with silver ink that reflected rainbow colors and glowed in the dark, carefully painting patterns from the games he played with Tamura that related to the Shimura family, and replaced the laces outright. This masterpiece was given to Tamura as a special loot reward the same day when Tamura managed to complete a task he gave the man when Izuku started teaching him a month ago. Tamura grinned madly upon seeing them and cooed over the yamper on one before slipping them on with no problems. Meaning Tamura was without a doubt Shimura Tenko, and thanked Izuku for coming up with a good cosmetic reward, questioning if he'd get even more if completed other hard quests, and Izuku confirmed it with a smile despite how much his heart ached knowing that Tamura had to be some pawn in a plan by All for One. The plan was very short-sighted and not at all thought through beyond proving Tamura was a two-toes. And one of the many things he hadn't considered was that Kurogiri would know what two-toes were, that he knew Tamura was one of them, and that he knew exactly what Izuku had just pulled. An oversight that became clear as soon as Izuku turned back to ask Kurogiri something, and his voice died in his throat upon locking eyes with the man. Kurogiri's face only had eyes, and while most couldn't read solid eyes as well as he could, Izuku was certain even the blind could feel the tension in Kurogiri's knowing gaze. Izuku had all but accepted that he would be killed for his stupidity in that same moment and cursed himself for mistaking Kurogiri's silence for ignorance. And now it was going to get him killed and kick-start a war that would get thousands killed. Izuku remained pleasant throughout the rest of the session, not hinting he was aware of his fate in order to not upset Tamura. And when it came time for him to go, Izuku was quite sure he'd be walking off a cliff rather than being put back in his hotel room. For a moment, Izuku stood still and wondered if his perception was being altered by a quirk of some kind to lull him into a false sense of security. Then his phone dinged with a text of Kurogiri. Izuku hesitated for a second, then gave in a temptation to look at the message. Kurogiri. Kurogiri. Deku-Sensei, I believe there is something we must discuss. Izuku took a deep breath and sat down on the bed, getting a strong feeling that he'd want to be sitting down for this conversation. Kurogiri. Deku-Sensei. Yes, we probably do. Kurogiri. You know that Tamura was originally quirkless, much like yourself. Deku-Sensei? Indeed. Deku-Sensei. Are you going to turn me over to Sensei? Kurogiri didn't respond right away, something that was very unusual. Kurogiri. Kurogiri. No. Deku-Sensei, why? Kurogiri's chat bubble popped up once, then disappeared before Kurogiri typed out what he would say. Kurogiri. Kurogiri. Because the only directives that Sensei has given me at this moment are to protect and watch after Tamura. Deku-Sensei? Directives? Do you mean your orders? Kurogiri. Correct. Unless Sensei asks me directly of you, I shall not mention you to him. Deku-Sensei. Why not? You know I'll just keep digging, don't you? Kurogiri's text bubble popped up repeatedly before he finally answered. Kurogiri. Kurogiri, yes. Izuku blinked, staring at him phone, the same unsettling feeling returning as he rethought over all of his time interacting with Kurogiri, and his heart sank to be right beside his stomach as he typed out his next message, suddenly having an idea for why he never found anything about Kurogiri's life before All for One. Kurogiri. Deku-Sensei. Kurogiri. Warp Gate isn't your birth quirk, is it? Kurogiri. No, it is not. Deku-Sensei. Did Sensei give you Warp Gate? Kurogiri. In a manner of speaking, yes, he technically is the one that is responsible for me possessing Warp Gate. Deku-Sensei. What do you mean by that? Kurogiri. Warp Gate is technically 3 quirks, not 1, Deku-Sensei. Deku-Sensei? 3. Kurogiri. Shadow Pass, Cloud, and GPS. Izuku gasped softly as he recognized the second quirk mentioned. UA student deaths were very, very rare once Niza took over. So naturally, when Shirakumo Oboro died in his second year, there were dozens of articles on the tragedy. Kurogiri. Deku-Sensei. Kurogiri. Isn't your name either, is it? Kurogiri. If I had any other name before Sensei gave me one, then I do not recall it. Deku-Sensei. What do you remember before you worked for Sensei Kurogiri? Kurogiri. Nothing. I have always worked for Sensei since the day I was created. Created? Izuku hissed. Not only could All for One put multiple quirks in one person, but had he found a way to make a person, or more likely create a separate personality from who knows what quirks. Kurogiri. Deku-Sensei. He made you? Why? Kurogiri. To watch over Tamura, since the one before me was not as obedient. Deku-Sensei. Other? Do you mean there was someone before you that watched Tamura? Kurogiri. Indeed, Deku-Sensei. Though he will occasionally try to regain control, but Sensei's collar makes such a thing impossible. Izuku sucked in his breath, through his teeth, making a slight hiss sound. Kurogiri. Deku-Sensei. But he's still around? Kurogiri. Yes, he is very much still around, and he is insistent that I refrain from telling Sensei about you. Deku-Sensei. Can I perhaps speak with him the next time we meet? Kurogiri. No. That would be against one of Sensei's directives. Deku-Sensei. You can't speak freely. Kurogiri. Correct. Izuku's heart twinged. Kurogiri. Deku-Sensei. But you can say whatever you want over text. Kurogiri. Indeed, Deku-Sensei. Deku-Sensei. Then can you please answer some of my questions? Kurogiri. I shall do the best of my ability. Izuku took a deep breath to organize his thoughts, so he could figure out what to ask first because he had a lot of questions for Kurogiri, and he didn't know where to start. Eventually, though, he started typing out his first question, which would be the first of many he'd ask that night, knowing that regardless of the answer, he would not be sleeping well. Kurogiri. Deku-Sensei. What does Sensei do with quirkless people? Izuku had never been tempted to drink before. He had been offered alcohol by his students a fair few times more than he thought it would, but the nightmares he just had last night had made him reconsider it as he sat next to the toilet, since he wasn't sure he would not vomit. It's not like it would have been illegal. He was technically old enough to drink, given Japan's weird laws on the quirkless. Getting his hands on it was the problem, since most people weren't inclined to let teenagers buy alcohol. His students weren't morally challenged by that, though. Kurogiri had been forthcoming enough for Izuku's unconscious mind to run wild, mainly of blinding pain all over, as different quirks were forced into his body by a shadowy figure with its arm tightly wrapped around his neck. When he was twisted into something he couldn't even remember, Izuku was paraded about as a lifeless zombie, fully aware as his body was moving around as someone else's puppet. And it was quite tempting to have a sip of something mind-numbing after all that had been learned, mainly since he had far too much going on in his life that was massively stressing him out to the point that getting blackout drunk just for a second so he didn't have to think for a little while sounded really tempting. Before he finished his talk with Kurogiri, he did ask about why All For One attacked the Shimura family so viciously and erased Tenko's memory. The answer was simple as it was crude: revenge. Kurogiri didn't have all the details, but he had enough pieces to get a decent picture of what had happened. All For One had a brother way back when, and his quirk could be passed on to others. And with his brother being opposed to All For One's reign of terror, he had kicked off a line of successors that had opposed All For One and kept him from taking over Japan so far. Shimura Nana was the seventh wielder and the only one to have both a family, as well as a close bond with her successor, All Might the Eighth. So, as a petty vindictive man, All For One he had given Tenko the Decay quirk, knowing it would be only a matter of time before Tenko killed his family to make All Might think he failed to protect what was left of his mentor's family, only to manipulate Tenko into a villain that would hate everything All Might stood for, the emotional gut punch, because he really hated the current user. Izuku hadn't asked any more questions after that because he didn't think he was mentally capable of handling any more that night, and judging by the nightmares, he was quite right. But it left him with this unshakable feeling that he had to do something to rescue both Tenko and Kurogiri from All For One's grasp, which was a pretty tall order even for him, given he knew nothing about how to help someone who was brainwashed with a quirk cult style, or how to counter whatever quirk was keeping Kurogiri obedient. Kurogiri hadn't said it, but he was clearly programmed by some quirk to never go against All For One. Feeling his stomach had calmed down some, Izuku stood up and splashed some cold water on his face, the chills settling his nerves some as he fought to calm down. He was getting far too worked up over this, and reminded himself it was only because of his stress that this was affecting him the way it was. He would figure out a way to save them. He would just need to be creative, and it's not like he wasn't already looking into ways to get people out of cults and cult mindsets. There was the whole issue going on with Hawks after all. Hawks had caught his eye with his debut and subsequent raise to number 4 in the same year. The news had spent an entire month producing articles on him alone, so it would be hard not to be a little curious about this new hero. And he found nothing. Most people would brush that off as part of the Hero Privacy Act of 24. A lot of the top 10 used the act to keep their family and loved ones away from the public eye, but Izuku wasn't most people. He used to be a rabid hero fan, and he found nothing on Hawks. Even with some digging, he couldn't find one picture of Hawks' trademark red wings in any Hero School yearbooks or import papers, which would mean that Hawks would have somehow gotten a hero license without going through the normal system, and he somehow had the same level of competence as heroes who trained for a decade. And then there was his body. Izuku was very against body shaming, but there was nothing healthy about Hawk's figure. Unless you have a very specific quirk, people don't have naturally occurring abs that's sharply defined without a super dangerous diet. One known to have almost killed actors, almost as well known for the people it did kill. Meeting him by chance drooling over rats was a coincidence, but confirmed to him a lot of what he thought about Hawks being true. Especially the one where he feared that Hawks did have a strong predator quirk and needed to eat meat despite his official accounts claiming he was a vegetarian. So after that chance meeting, Izuku got the Vespas to dig up everything they could find on the young hero. And they found next to nothing, which was majorly concerning that the Vespas couldn't find anything on the man except for a few really old documents. And when he did get his hands on a copy of those papers, Izuku couldn't help losing any shred of respect he had left for the HPSC as a whole. And that was why after finished his work in Kumamoto, he stood in front of Ami's, texting his friends as he waited for the blonde hero to show up. It seems that Takami had taken Izuku's last-minute comment from their second meeting seriously and had met with him at Ami's every Tuesday. Zuri. Takami called getting his attention, and Izuku saw Takami practically bouncing over to him with the biggest grin on his face under his mask. He couldn't help smiling back and accepting the hug and face nuzzles Takami had started giving him. Takami had been looking better since he was eating meat regularly. More color in his cheeks, and his fans were blowing up the internet with before and after pictures comparing his wings, proclaiming how much glossier and vibrant his wings were now. It was just a relief that Takami was getting healthier. "Hey, Tweety, got your wallet today?" Izuku teased, quickly putting his phone away, and Takami pouted at him and crossed his arms. "That was one time, Zuri, and yes, I do have money on me, and I plan to get me a rabbit this time," Takami huffily told him, poking his chest before turning his eyes onto the rabbit on a poster, eyes narrowed in determination. Izuku couldn't say he was surprised by Takami's choice or his insistence, given Raijin had gone on to constantly jump Takami on his route to keep Takami away from finding anything on him or discovering something he shouldn't, which was probably really frustrating for Takami once he considered it. Izuku's side rolled his eyes and just grabbed Takami's arm and began pulling him inside. "Well, don't stand there, Tweety. Those wabbits ain't going to hunt themselves, you cockatoo," Izuku joked. Takami scoffed, shaking his head, not making any move to get away from Izuku. Their conversation falling into the normal rhythm, Izuku would talk about helping his students learn anything from math to a bit of science, careful to not let on more than he had to, and it was easy since he had tons of small, insignificant ones to share that wouldn't tip Takami off to a shadier business. Takami would chime in asking about a thing here or a comment there, but was otherwise content letting Izuku carry most of the conversation. Izuku really hoped it was because Takami liked to just listen to him talking and not because Takami didn't have a life outside of being a hero. He knew it was the latter, though. He could still hope it was both. The shopping was over quite quickly, and Izuku was talking about the time he brought the children in the south side to the aquarium while Takami was eating his rabbit. Leaving out certain details, of course, but Takami was pretty into it, most likely because he's never been to one in his life. But once he finished the story, Takami asked one of his few unprompted questions. "Hey, I never asked, but who is your favorite hero, Zuri?" Izuku blinked, slightly taken aback. He never would have thought Takami would have turned the focus to heroics, but he was willing to roll with it. He just needed a minute to think. Geez. My favorite is an underground hero, so you probably haven't heard of them, but they're called Eraserhead. Gang Orca is a close second, though," Izuku told him, rubbing the back of his neck. Takami's eyes widened. "You know Eraserhead? That's cool. Did they rescue you before or something?" Takami asked, nearly slipping on using the correct gender. Izuku chuckled, waving his hands dismissively. "Nah, nothing exciting like that, Tweety. I dreamed of becoming a hero like most kids, and just looking for a hero like me. Eraserhead was the closest thing and seemed really cool, so they just sort of became my favorite," Izuku explained, with a half-truth. Eraserhead hadn't become his favorite hero until after the SSI, and Eraserhead had completely earned his respect because it was one thing for the man to actively patrol a red light like Yaizu. But when Masao-sen told him that he had dropped everything to save his classmates at the mall attack, Izuku couldn't help loving the hero even more. Takami gave a soft nod of understanding. "Oh, I get it, so you have some kind of quirk neutralizing thing too, then?" Takami guessed, taking Izuku by surprise for a second time. "What? No, I'm a two-toes Tweety. Izuku corrected automatically. Takami blinked his head, falling to the side, slightly, 2 toes. Takami repeated, and Izuku supposed he should have known Takami wouldn't know the term himself since the HPSC likely wasn't invested in the quirkless community, much less tell Takami of it if they did. Yeah, you know, quirkless, though we prefer the term 2 toes since it feels less like we're missing something. Izuku answered, then brought up a shoe to show it off. See, look, I'm even wearing primordial shoes. Izuku pointed out, bringing up one of his feet to further make his point. Takami stared at him, then his eyes went down to his offered shoe before returning to Izuku's face. It took another minute before it finally seemed to sink in for Takami. Oh, he muttered, clearly struggling to figure out what he should say and looking quite conflicted. Izuku's heart twinged but forced it aside, and he stood up, grabbing his bags. It's okay, I understand. I won't bother you anymore, Tweety. Izuku promised, turning to walk away. Takami's response to learning he was quirkless hurt. He would never say it, but yes, it had. He had thought Takami wouldn't be that judgmental, especially after spending some time together one-on-one. He was certain that Takami was at least a little fond of him, but that was fine. He'd continue his plans to free Takami, of course, but if he didn't want to be friends with Izuku, then that was his choice, and Izuku would respect it. Someone suddenly grabbed Izuku's arm, and he was forcefully turned back to a panicked-looking Takami. No, don't leave. You don't bother me. Takami pleaded, shocking Izuku greatly. Izuku's mouth opened to question Takami for his sudden outburst before something clicked in Izuku's mind. Takami had an avian quirk. Avian quirked people, while social, were known to be oddly territorial of friends and family, the same way parrots got super attached to their owners. And Izuku was most likely the only person Takami had to talk with outside of uniform and his persona that wasn't a part of the commission. And depending on how traumatized Takami was, it was entirely possible he was now super attached to Izuku. Okay, Tweety, I won't leave. But could you let go of my arm, please? Izuku calmly requested, taking a step closer, so Takami himself could be reassured he wasn't leaving. Takami blinked, then his eyes went down to the hand still tightly gripping Izuku's upper arm, and promptly his face lost all color as he stared at his hand, terrified. No. Takami whisper yelled as his free hand quickly began trying to rip his fingers off, but his panic kept them firm, and when his grip was to the point of snapping the bone, Izuku stepped in, placing a hand on the beanie, causing a momentary lapse in Takami's attempts as he flinched at the contact. Tweety, look at me. Izuku told him, and Takami reluctantly met his eyes. This is fine, we are fine. You're just rapting. It's completely normal and expected for people that have avian quirks. I've had plenty of kids do this before, and I know we'll both be completely fine, he said, slipping into Deku-Sensei mood and gently stroked Takami's head. Takami was still very stiff, so Izuku slowly guided him to sit on the bench again and made sure to use all his talents to gently coax Takami. Eventually, he had calmed the blonde down enough with a breathing exercise so that he could remove his hand from Izuku's arm without forcing the fingers back. There, see? No harm done, Tweety. Izuku assured by flexing his arm despite how it ached when he did. He needed to grab some hero-grade makeup to cover the bruise so none of his students wouldn't freak out if he took off his shirt. Deeply mortified, Takami pulled away from Izuku and looked like he wanted to just disappear as he avoided looking at him. Why, yeah. Thanks for letting me, wait it out, Zuri. Takami mumbled, hugging himself. Izuku's hands clenched tightly into fists at the sight, because he knew this exaggerated reaction to something so normal had to be because of the commission's doing. Izuku would need to do something about them, but he hardly had the time free even with Kurogiri's portal travel. At the least, he could ask the Vespas to dig up everything they could for him to use later, when he had more time. Looking down, Izuku saw the rabbit Takami had been eating, and he pointed at it. Are you going to finish that? Izuku asked, diverted to his forgotten meal. All right. Takami muttered, flustered, quickly picking up the half-eaten body and continued to eat, nibbling on an arm. Izuku further took his attention from what had just happened and proceeded to tell him about some facts he relearned about ants for one of his students. After being examined by a doctor against his will, Shoyuta was allowed to go home and watched by Namuri until Hizashi could get home and chew Shoyuta out himself. The mall incident aside, Shoyuta didn't have to worry about his students being troublesome and getting into any more random villain attacks. The next day, when he came into work after patrol, he was expecting all 5 involved students to be absent given the event that had happened the day before. So one could imagine a shock when he crawled into his classroom and saw Miyake politely sitting in his chair like any other day, and Miyake tilted his head once he realized Shoyuta was staring at him. Shoyuta decided to not bring any attention to Miyake immediately, despite how much he wanted to pull the boy aside to ask why he was here and not at home when most people would be, or why he didn't take a few days off to goof off with his friends like most kids his age would. And he wasn't the only one confused by Miyake being there, because both Namuri and Hizashi were blowing up his phone asking why he was in class. Shoyuta had to wait until lunch to pull Miyake aside, so he could speak with the boy. "Do you need something, Aizawa-sensei?" Miyake asked, his head tilted to the side, one of many habits he noticed his student was using more to express himself. Shoyuta paused as he looked up at his student, wondering how he should play this. "Miyake, you know you can take a few days off after what happened yesterday," he said, unsure if he should be worried about Miyake being one of those masochistically few that overwork themselves instead of working through their emotions. Miyake blinked. "Yes, but I'm fine, sensei," Miyake replied, keeping his head tilted. Normally, Miyake's being less emotional than the average teen was a relief for Shoyuta, but that monotone was really biting Shoyuta in the ass right now, because he couldn't tell if Miyake was being genuine right now, and if that was better or worse. "I understand that, Miyake. However, it would be alright if you wanted to take a day off to gather yourself. After such a large villain attack, I would understand, and we could have someone bring you the assignments like your fellow classmates," Shoyuta offered after he inhaled. "I prefer to be here, working, than sitting around at home, sensei," Miyake told him after a second. Shoyuta quietly sighed and crossed his arms. "Okay, but I'd like for you to speak with Hound Dog before you go home for the day, Miyake," Shoyuta requested. Hoping he wouldn't have to order him to see the man, he did not want any of his students to feel like therapy was a punishment, even indirectly. "I will if that will make you feel more comfortable, sensei," Miyake replied, and Shoyuta supposed that was as good as an agreement he was going to get from the boy. "Yes, Miyake, that would be ideal," Shoyuta said, and Miyake nodded before he walked out of the classroom to go get lunch. Shoyuta, meanwhile, texted Inui if he could fit Miyake in today after school, as he made his way to Nizu's office, knowing he'd get no peace in the staff room. Mainly Namuri and Hizashi would be nagging him about being a bad influence on his students and them taking after him when it came to coping, but they couldn't blame him for Miyake coming today because Shoyuta hadn't shown up like a complete wreck this year. Unfortunately, he couldn't just avoid his coworkers, and most of them were concerned that Miyake had come to school since they had heard from Hizashi and Namuri what happened yesterday. At least no one had been accusatory about it, and understood he hadn't ordered Miyake to come in, and Inui had confirmed he could squeeze Miyake in. So instead of going home right away after school, Shoyuta sat in the teacher's shared office doing his grading there as he waited for Inui to finish up with Miyake, and hopefully the kid wasn't that messed up in the head. Because if he learned that the kid had come to school due to someone making Miyake think he had to work through whatever pain he had to be a hero, then Shoyuta was sure he could get Hizashi to be his alibi if it came down to it. Ryo grunted as he searched his cabinets for the first-year student files. Finding Miyake's was being a bit difficult since someone must have rearranged his files yesterday. He couldn't smell him in his file closet, but he damn well knew it was Nizu's doing since the rodent liked to keep him on his toes or something. In all honesty, Nizu was probably doing it to fuck with him. Damn rat. He eventually found the file in the R section. Why Nizu insisted on a sorting system based on the English alphabet was beyond him, but at least he could find things when Nizu didn't pull any stunts. He hadn't seen Miyake Masao yet as the school counselor, so he hadn't read up on the boy. He probably should have in hindsight, knowing Aizawa's tendency to not read his students' files at all, but that was more on him since he should have seen this coming. But with the knock on the door, Ryo had to privately curse Nizu because he really hated going into these things blind, because there was a good chance he'd accidentally trigger the poor kid. "Come on in," he gruffly said, and Miyake peeked his head in. Ryo immediately sniffed the air. The boy unsurprisingly smelt like most reptilian people, though Miyake smelt more like an aquatic species than the arid breed his quirk was named for. Perhaps one of his parents' quirks was a water-based lizard? But Ryo was more concerned by what he couldn't smell from the boy. Dogs were great therapy animals because they could smell emotions, a trait that carried over to those with dog quirks. It was one of the reasons so many of them went into psychology or criminology, much like he himself had, so when he could barely smell anything from the boy. It was a rare thing to not smell any emotion from kids unless it was quirk-related. Rio took another quick sniff and caught the boy, who seemed to be in a neutral state currently, which was better than anxious, though not by much. Seeing the boy was still by the door, Rio motioned Miyake to come in and sit down. Even sitting down, Miyake was taller than him, so Rio had to crane his neck up at an uncomfortable angle, but he didn't mention it. "Hello, Miyake. I believe this is the first time we've met." Rio greeted, and the boy nodded. "Yes, though I've heard of you and your work, Hound Dog-san," Miyake told him. "Oh," Rio said. "I suppose you've looked into a fair few mutant quirked heroes then?" He guessed it wasn't uncommon for hero hopefuls to look for heroes like themselves, and he certainly looked up to the heroes of his day before he became a hero, but the boy shook his head. "No, I've never been very interested in heroics, but my old tutor spoke about your charity work a lot," Miyake explained, and Rio caught the faintest hint of fondness from the boy as he looked to the side at a bushy plant he kept. Rio blinked a bit, taken aback. Very few people got into heroics without being fans of some kind in this generation, so Rio felt he could be rightly surprised by the offhand comment, but decided to ask about another time. "I see. Feel free to simply call my Inu-san, since my codename can be a bit of a mouthful, Miyake-kun," Rio threw out there. If Miyake felt anything about the added honorific, Rio couldn't smell it, and the boy merely nodded, turning back to face Rio. "I guess you don't want to beat around the bush, Miyain?" Rio guessed after a few seconds and got another nod, though Miyake flicked his tongue out, likely a habit no different from his need to scratch himself. "And I presume you know why you're here, Miyake-kun?" Rio asked. "Because of the villain attack at the mall yesterday," Miyake deftly answered without hesitation, and Rio nodded. There wasn't any flare of emotion upon bringing up the event. "Yes, it is normal to want to get back to normal after something traumatic like that, Miyake-kun," Rio commented, and he would have said more, but he smelt Miyake's confusion as he tilted his head to the side. "Traumatic?" the boy repeated. "I admit that I was worried for Amajiki-kun and Oswald-kun, but that was because they were trapped inside with the villains. But I don't think anything about that day was that bad," Miyake told Rio, slightly baffled. Rio was a bit more prepared for this. Hero students often responded with denial when confronted with trauma because they didn't want to admit that they were victims of any kind because of some stupid belief it made them look weak, but there was no defensiveness from Miyake, just confusion. "Well, even if you weren't hurt during the attack like Amajiki and Mineta Dash," Rio began to explain, but a dull, albeit sharp annoyance considering how monotone Miyake-san had been made him stop. "Oswald-kun prefers to use his first name, Inu-san," Miyake interrupted, slightly terse. "He does not like to be called by his stepmother's name," he briefly explained to Rio. He merely nodded, tucking that little nugget away for when he started seeing mine, Oswald, when he returned to school, along with a request to see Oswald's student file to check out what was going on in his family life. "Right, apologies. You might not have been hurt like either of them, Miyake-kun, but that doesn't mean it wasn't any less traumatic on you, Hato, Heya, and Togata." Rio finished only to feel even more confusion from the boy. Miyake's mouth opened and closed before he asked, "Do you know where I live? Or where I was born?" Miyake carefully asked, as if concerned that he would sound patronizing to the man. Internally, Rio cursed not being able to read the boy's file, because you don't say something like that without a good reason. One that Rio would have liked to know before this session started. "No, I'm afraid not, Miyake-kun," Rio admitted. Miyake hesitated, smelling resigned but expected of this fact. "I'm a Southsider, Inu-san. I've lived there all of my life until I moved so I could go to school here. I live in Yaizu now," Miyake told him. Rio's body stiffened upon hearing that you lived in the South Side. Rio repeated, shocked. He had heard of the area being condemned decades back. He knew that people technically could be living there now, but that didn't mean he thought any of the students would be from there. Miyake nodded. "Indeed, I'm quite experienced with being in dangerous situations. Compared to what I'm used to happening on a daily basis, the incident at the mall was quite minor. I was far more worried about Amajiki-kun and Oswald-kun, since they aren't used to such attacks themselves, and the heroes on scene weren't very helpful." Miyake replied with a hint of anger spiking as his pupils narrowed. "You think they could have done more on scene?" Rio asked, suddenly having a better understanding of why Miyake might not have the average view people had on heroes, and much more concerned for just how much Miyake was used to. I know they could have Inu-san. I've seen better coordination from children, and despite knowing they couldn't handle the villains, they wouldn't call for backup. Miyake spat, anger and disgust flaring to life. Okay, Rio would need to unpack that hostility later, so Miyake might become a regular for him to discuss these issues, or at least what they stem from. Miyake exhaled and leaned back in the chair, anger fading to faintly apologetic, "Sorry, Inu-san. I'm aware how my emotional range can be odd and disorienting to other animal types," Miyake said, glancing away. Rio blinked. "What do you mean, Miyake-kun?" he questioned. "I know a fair few animal quirk people, and most of them are put off by my low emotional output. I've been told that's normal due to how animal communication is based far more on emotions, and very few people don't have those emotional responses, so it is jarring." Miyake elaborated. "That must be difficult." Rio responded, unsure what to say to that. He understood most people that didn't have animal quirks couldn't understand what emotions were like unless they were empaths. But to think so much of his reactions based on that was on this unspoken language was something for him to process at another time. Miyake shrugged. "It's something you get used to, Inu-san. I've never known any different," Miyake said with a wave of the hand as he brushed it off. "If you don't mind, Miyake-kun, I'd like to know a little more about where you're living now," Rio asked. Miyake thrilled. "Sure. What would you like to know, Inu-san?" Miyake asked, tilting his head. Shoyuta frowned as he stared at the clock. It was well 10 minutes past the half an hour Inui promised to have with his student, which was worrying. He might actually need to get Hizashi to be his alibi. Before he could become too concerned over this, Inui finally came into the office looking worse for wear, and once he spotted Shoyuta, there was a clear disappointment in Inui's eyes. Well, fuck. Shoyuta thought he had expected anger, but for Inui to be disappointed was probably worse, because that meant Shoyuta had overlooked something. "Aizawa," Inui tersely said once he stood in front of Shoyuta, and he didn't think he was going to like whatever lecture he was about to get. "You really need to start reading your kids' files." Inui continued in a tone that would have been scolding if Inui didn't look so tired. Shoyuta sighed. This was not the first time Inui had told him this, and it never made him feel any better. "What did I miss this time?" Shoyuta asked, unsure how bad this was going to get, though he hoped he hadn't missed anything too big. Inui scowled. "Miyake has lived most of his life in the South Side. Yes, that's South Side Aizawa. And apparently he now lives in the area you patrol in Yaizu, because he's seen you working on the mornings he wakes up early." Inui explained, and Shoyuta couldn't help staring up at Inui. "What?" Shoyuta dumbly questioned, but Inui just handed him a thick file with Miyake's name on it. Miyake is a South Sider, as they call themselves. He is quite used to the walk to school being more dangerous than what happened yesterday, what with having to avoid some of the most dangerous gangs just to get to a train station, Aizawa. Inui commented, crossing his arms, as he waited for Shoyuta to open the file with a huff. The kid is at least self-aware enough to understand most people aren't used to life-threatening situations on a daily basis like he is, which is a problem in and of itself, Aizawa. Kids shouldn't be that used to nearly dying in any context. Miyake is going to be seeing me after school from now on. He didn't argue when I asked him to see for regular sessions, just wanted me to sign something for his old tutor, since he was a fan of mine. Inui added, already sounding tired as he shook his head. "Seriously though, Aizawa, you need to start reading your kids' files, so we avoid these damn situations," Inui said before grabbing his things at his desk, then leaving Shoyuta to stew. Shoyuta frowned, turning back to the thick file in his hands, and began reading it. Shuichi frowned, his hand on his chin, as he stared at the machine in front of him. It was a larger production machine used to weave a large amount of cloth from wool, but for some reason it wasn't working quite right. The machine's arms weren't lining up, and so the patterns came out haphazard at best, even if it got everything else right. Shuichi had been working on it for the past hour or so for his software credits. He rewrote the code in the machine 4 different times, and he was admittedly growing frustrated with it, since it was last task of the day, and he'd need to finish it before he could go home. At this point, Shuichi wasn't sure what was wrong anymore, and he decided to start from the very beginning, this time going over every single line of code regardless of what it was for, only to find the one line of corrupted code for the button input which misread everything, because it was programmed for a different but similar long. He sighed, whacking himself up the head for not figuring it out earlier, but quickly looked for the part and reprogrammed it for Japanese. Shuichi gave the machine a test run and smiled as it wove a simple pattern as he requested it to. Satisfied, he put everything back together and went to find his instructor so he could get his grade mark up and return home for the day, and preened over Gajiko-san, observing his work, then dismissed him with a "see you tomorrow." He didn't need any more prompting and proceeded to grab his things and to start his journey home, in a bit more of a hurry than he normally would be, because today was a very special day, his birthday. He hadn't been excited for his birthday since before his mom had passed. At best, this was just another day, and last year was the worst, having been thrown out. But this year would be different because he had people to celebrate with. The Miyakes had been very good to him, not just letting him live and eat with them, but sort of adopting him into their family. Kaori being the most vocal, and followed him around once he returned home to show him things she had found, or whatever Deku-Sensei had taught her that time. Masao wasn't around as much, but he was a quiet comfort as one of the few full-bodied reptiles he personally knew and shared his grievances. Their father was scary at times, but a hard-working man that cared about his kids. Dabi was probably his best friend if the guy would ever get over himself and admit they were actually friends, and Magno was great to talk with at the end of a long day with some treats to munch on. Then there was Deku-Sensei, who was the kindest and most benevolent person he had ever met. The young boy had made good on his promise, and was the whole reason Shuichi was studying at all, which wasn't even the greatest of the things he had personally seen Deku-Sensei has done for others. Hearing of Deku-Sensei's actions during the Southside Inferno was one thing, but last month Shuichi had gotten to see such a thing for himself. On a much smaller scale, granted, but that didn't make the strength he saw any less potent, as he, along with everyone else, followed Deku-Sensei's orders to put out and fight the fire Endeavor had caused. And now he was going to have his first birthday party. Kaori had tried to hide it so that it would be a surprise party, but toddlers were hardly masters of stealth. Shuichi played along, pretending he didn't notice any of the plans Kaori was drawing up in crayon, and it was utterly adorable how much work she was putting into making this party the best one ever. So Shuichi couldn't help this giddy excitement, as made his way home with sun beaming high in the clear sky. Today was going just fine other than the hitch with the weaving machine, and he was looking forward to whatever Kaori had planned for him. He barely even registered the looks he normally got as he rode the train to Sakiya Station and just looked at his messages from Masao and his friends. They unfortunately couldn't make it because of their classes. They had promised they had sent his presents ahead of time, and he knew they had because Kaori had tried to hide the boxes that were sent the day before. The ride was short, and Shuichi immediately moved on, heading to the south side, when someone jumped out of an alleyway and grabbed his arm, scaring the hell out of him. Shuichi whirled around and saw a panicked girl in a middle school uniform. "Help," the girl pleaded, tugging on his arm hard. "Hey, what's wrong?" Shuichi questioned as he was dragged into the alley. "It's my friend. She's hurt, and I can't get her free. Please hurry," the girl begged, tears falling down her face, and Shuichi's excitement was quashed seeing this girl's fear. Hey, don't worry, I'll help. Just take me where your friend is," Shuichi promised, letting the girl lead him away. Getting a closer look at the girl, he notes that he knows the uniform that the green net girl is wearing as the same uniform he spotted Uraraka-chan's wore a few times when she couldn't change before coming to meet with Shoji. Maybe she was from Uraraka-chan's school? He did think she was familiar the more he looked at her, but before he could definitively place her, the girl stopped in front of a large abandoned building covered in graffiti and falling apart much like the other building in the south side. "She's trapped under a fallen beam. It's on her leg," the girl said, yanking on his arm to come inside, and Shuichi dutifully followed along. It wasn't an uncommon accident, and Shuichi figured that this girl and her friend were the stereotypical pair of dumb kids that wandering into the more dangerous parts of the area. The girl was more frantic, and after a few seconds of entering the building, ran off ahead of him. "Hey, wait!" Shuichi cried, trying to keep up, but he didn't have as much stamina as Masao did, and lost the girl around a corner when his nose was strongly hit by the smell of rot. It was awful, but familiar smell he's come to know in his days on the street. He's had enough experience with it that he could tell what he'd just smelt as not any animal, but a human, a real old one, if the putrid stench was anything to go by. His mouth immediately went dry. "Hey, where did you go, miss?" Shuichi yelled carefully, searching the building hoping that he could get the girls out before they stumbled upon whatever poor soul had passed away inside the building. Unfortunately, the building's disrepair had made it difficult to move quickly, and it was like a labyrinth with very little light inside to guide him with the few windows he came across completely boarded up. The girl hadn't answered him as he searched, and the smell of rot only got worse, so he must be getting closer to the body wherever it was. Honestly, Shuichi was starting to feel there was something wrong going on here. Wandering the building like some horror movie character, as the only sound he could hear was his own footsteps and the echo of his voice. And the rot was only getting worse that he had to breath in and out of his mouth to keep from gagging at the foul scent. The sooner he could find the girl and her friend and leave this place, the better. So Shuichi pressed on, having stopped calling for the girl in hopes he might hear her or her friend, since the building had great echolocation apparently. He was rewarded with a soft thump almost directly above him. Shuichi raced up to the second floor, only to be hit by an even stronger wave of rotting corpse smell, and Shuichi wasn't sure it was just one body anymore, and that would only be more concerning, because you can argue one body could be an overdose or victim of exposure, but multiple is where you start suspecting something more human. Shuichi turned a corner, having worked out this room to probably be the one over the hall he was in, and called out, "Hey miss, are you in here, dash?" He choked on those words once his eyes adjusted and saw what was in the room. A total of 10 bodies lay in the room with large pools of dried blood around them or splashed on the surroundings, all lit up by a single lamp on a box. Shuichi almost instantly recognized the uniforms each body was wearing as from the various high or middle schoolers he sees on the train, though all but 2 of the bodies were fresh enough to be easily recalled from missing posters and news stories he's seen over the past month. However, it's the bodies slumped against the wall right beside the lamp that truly cemented the horror of the situation. The single glassy eye of the girl who brought him there stared back at him, half her face and body covered in blood from where her other eye had been stabbed by something, as well as other stab wounds. But it was the fact the girl had undoubtedly died days ago that made his heart drop, and he took a step back, his body trembling as he tried to understand what the hell he was seeing, because that long, bright neon green hair of hers was unmistakable. Before Shuichi could fully recover, something cold and sharp was quickly jabbed into his side, and he screamed from the explosion of pain. His body instinctively yanked itself away, and he tumbled over one of the corpses in his flailing. Shuichi turned around on the ground, clutching his wound, feeling his blood pooling his hand. He hadn't needed bother searching for his attacker, as the green-necked girl he'd so foolishly followed here stood at the doorway with a simple but bloody kitchen knife in hand, grinning down at him. "Oh wowie, your blood looks so much better than I thought it would against your scales, lizardkin," the girl cheerfully proclaimed as her face turned red. "And you almost found my playroom all on your own, too. So I wouldn't have to drag your body here like I had to with the others. Thank you so much, lizardkin," she said with a sadistic glee as walked over to him. Shuichi tried to crawl away from the clearly dangerous girl that intended to harm him, but the pain from his back made that very difficult. So the girl easily approached him and pinned him with a single foot on his chest that caused his pain to nearly double. Yes, yes, yes. Keep making that face. You look so handsome covered in your own blood like this, Lizzie. I can call you that now, right? We are so close now, right? I'm going to be you now, so of course we are." The girl giggled as she brought the bloody blade to her mouth and licked off the blood, fucking moaning at the taste. And despite his terror, Shuichi became even more horrified as he watched in the limited light as the girl's skin slowly melted off of her and revealed a version of himself with the same crazy eyes and grin from before, contorting his face into something spine-chilling. The girl, Noah's double, proceeded to slid their empty hand over their new form and groping their new body with a chur. "So this is what it's like to have scales. I love it, Lizzie." And the smells that his double squealed eyes half-lidded in a love-drunk expression. Thoroughly and absolutely terrified, and aided by a mix of pain and blood loss, Shuichi grabbed the severed hand of the nearest body, then took advantage of the double's euphoria, exploring its body to chuck it at the lamp, which broke as soon as it hit the ground. Not wasting a second, Shuichi kicked the double in the crotch as hard as possible to get them off of him. His voice screeched in protest, but Shuichi blocked it out as he scrambled for one of the walls and started climbing up it and out of the room, sticking to the ceiling while steadfast, ignoring the raging agony it made from his back. That wasn't very nice, Lizzie. If you wanted to play hide and seek, you could have just said so. He heard his voice hiss, and the anger in the echoes made Shuichi shudder and pick up speed as he tried to find some way out of the damned building, but there wasn't any trace of the windows he saw before, and Shuichi had no idea where the hell the entrance was because of his mad dash to get away. Oh, where did you go, Lizzie? His double chud, and Shuichi sped up attempts to get away and find somewhere he could hide at least. He stumbled upon a hole on the ceiling of the hall and immediately went in it and up to the floor above, then hid himself in a room, barricading himself by closing the door, then curled up in a corner feeling his head getting light, the double's voice teasing echoes all over and keeping him tense as he held his wound. His hand went back to his wound and he whimpered when he brushed it, unsure what else he could do since no one would know where he was and wasn't sure how much blood he's lost. Then, like a miracle, Shuichi's forgotten phone began vibrating, and he rushed to answer it. "Hey, Zilla. You miss your dash." Shuichi didn't let Dabi finish his question and immediately started talking over him. "Dabi, help me. I'm trapped in a building with some kind of shape-shifting manic." Shuichi hissed, tears falling from his eyes. "Zilla, where are you?" Dabi questioned, and Shuichi tried to recall where the building was. I don't know, it's got tagged from the night crawlers, the Kells, and the strikers. I think it's 3 stories and within walking distance of Sakiya Station. Shuichi told him, finding it harder to breathe just a bit. "Okay, I'll be there soon, just hang tight, got it?" Dabi promised, then hung up, and Shuichi swallowed the lump in his throat as he curled up and bunkered down. If Dabi said he'd be there soon, then he would be here before Shuichi knew it and take care of the doppelganger. He just needed to wait. Dabi was having too many decent days in a row, and that should have been the biggest red flag, but hanging around the Twinkie had been making him lower his guard. And to be fair, he really wasn't expecting to hear Zilla being that scared or chased by some psycho when he had managed to go to his nerdy tech classes all year without a hitch, but that meant little as he ran through the streets searching for a building like Zilla had described. It took far too long for him to find the damn place, and he didn't wait before he started stomping through the winding halls searching for any trace of Zilla. He found it a minute later when Zilla turned a corner and nearly jumped a foot in the air. "Zilla, there you are. The hell is happening?" he hissed, and Zilla hesitated for a second too long. "Sorry, but we need to get the girl out of here and ditch before that crazy finds us," the person that looked like Zilla said. Because despite how much this person looked like Zilla and had his voice, there was no doubt in his mind that this was the shapeshifter Zilla mentioned. This person didn't even try to sound or act more like his friend. Dabi didn't say anything about this and just followed this imposter for about a minute, then knocked him down and didn't hesitate to beat the double's face in. The imposter fought back, of course, so Dabi had to be careful when they tried to use Zilla's claws to swipe at his face, and the fucker got him pretty good, leaving 4 angry lines down his face before Dabi hit them over the head with a loose brick. "Motherfucker," Dabi hissed under his breath, clutching his eye, hoping that he wouldn't have any damage to the eye itself, then took a couple of zip ties and binding the now unconscious imposter and dragging a loose beam to pin the person where they were. "Zilla, the fuck are you?" Dabi yelled, expecting it to echo enough for him to hear Dabi. Not getting an answer, Dabi started looking again, calling for Zilla until he spotted the guy creeping past him on the ceiling with a broken pipe in his mouth. "Zilla, I swear, if try to hit me with that damn pipe, I will bring your charred bones back to the Twinkie after I fry you," Dabi lowly threatened, lighting his left hand on fire. A choked gasp of relief escaped Zilla, and he immediately dropped to the ground and drunkenly stumbled over to Dabi to crush him in a hug. "You're here." Zilla slurred, and Dabi quickly had to hug him back to keep Zilla from falling down. "Zilla?" Dabi questioned, only to realize that Zilla was bleeding bad, and Dabi panicked. "You got stabbed," Dabi exclaimed, and he scooped Zilla up and ran for the closest exit. The imposter could wait for Dabi to tear him apart later. Zilla needed treatment now. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through What If Villain Deku Became a Teacher at UA. I hope you found it as intriguing. A big shout out to Bloomer Bill for crafting such a compelling story. Don't forget to check out their profile on fanfiction.net for more amazing works. The link is in the description below. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to Zenin Fanfics for more fascinating explorations into the world of fanfiction and fantasy. See you guys in the next video.